All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Breaking Fairies. I am your host, Fox, also known as Joyce, and on this channel, we like to talk about the Tinkerbell myth and what it is. Basically, that fairies are gentle, kind souls who are helpful to humans. In this episode, we will be talking about changelings and their role in fae and human history. So, what is the definition of changeling? On dictionary.com, it says that a changeling is an ugly, stupid, or strange child left by fairies in place of a pretty, charming child. It's a great definition of it, and other websites say pretty much the same thing. The most basic definition is the exchange of a human child with a fairy child. A lot of times, a fae child will be sick, ugly, or overall different from the perfect image a fairy represents. Back when people were suspicious of changelings being inserted into their population, if someone was called a changeling, it was quite common for the entire village to crack down on them. This involved throwing them in the fireplace to prove their points, stabbing them with an iron knife, and hanging them. Sounds like fun. One trick people used to decide, if someone was a changeling was to brew beer in eggshells, or the eggshells themselves in water, and it would cause the changeling to burst out in song or amazement. This is quite famous today. It's a very well-known fact. But a long time ago, it wasn't very well known, which is why so many people died. So here's a story from a treasury of Irish fairy and folktales, and it is called The Brewery of Eggshells by T. Crofton Crocker, which I believe you can find online. I looked it up. I'm fairly certain you can. So, Mrs. Sullivan fancied that her youngest child had been exchanged by fairies, theft, and certainly appearances warranted such a conclusion, for in one night her healthy blue-eyed baby boy had become shriveled up into almost nothing and never ceased squalling and crying. This naturally made poor Mrs. Sullivan very unhappy, and all of the neighbors, by way of comforting her, said that her child was, beyond any kind of doubt, with the good people, and that one of themselves was put in his place. Mrs. Sullivan, of course, could not disbelieve what everyone told her, but she did not wish to hurt the thing, for although its face was so withered and its body wasted away to a mere skeleton, it had a strong resemblance to her own boy. She therefore could not find it in her heart to roast it alive on the griddle, or burn off its nose with red iron tongs, or to throw it out in the snow on the roadside. Notwithstanding these and several like proceedings, were strongly recommended to her for the recovery of her child. One day, who should Mrs. Sullivan meet but a cunning woman, well known about the country by the name of Ellen Leah, or Grey Ellen. She had the gift, however she got it, of telling where the dead were, and what was good for the rest of their souls, and could charm away warts and wens, and do a great many wonderful things of the same nature. "You're in grief this morning, Mrs. Sullivan," were the first words of Ellen Leah to her. "You may say that, Ellen," said Mrs. Sullivan, "and good, because I have to be in grief. For there was my own fine child, whipped from out of this cradle without as much as by your leave or ask your pardon, and an ugly, dawny bit of a shriveled up fairy put in his place. No wonder, then, that you see me in grief, Ellen." "Small blame to you, Mrs. Sullivan," said Ellen Leah. "But are you sure 'tis a fairy?" "Sure," echoed Mrs. Sullivan. "Sure enough I am to my sorrow, and can I doubt my own two eyes? Every mother's soul must feel for me." "Will you take an old woman's advice?" said Ellen Leah, fixing her wild and mysterious gaze upon the unhappy mother, and after a pause she added, "But maybe you'll call it foolish." "Can you get me back my own child, Ellen?" said Mrs. Sullivan with great energy. "If you do as I bid you," returned Ellen Leah, "you'll know." Mrs. Sullivan was silent in expectation, and Ellen continued, "Put down the big pot full of water on the fire, and make it boil like mad. Then get a dozen new-laid eggs, break them, and keep the shells, but throw away the rest. When that is done, put the shells in the pot of boiling water, and you will soon know whether it is your own boy or a fairy. And if you find that it is a fairy in the cradle, take the red-hot poker and cram it down its ugly throat. And you will not have much trouble with him after that, I promise you." Home went Mrs. Sullivan and did as Ellen Leah desired. She put the pot on the fire and plenty of turf under it, and set the water boiling at such a rate that if ever water was red hot, it surely was. The child was lying, for a wonder, quite easy and quiet in the cradle, every now and then cocking his eye, and that would twinkle as keen as a star on a frosty night over the great fire, and the big pot upon it. And he looked on with great attention to Mrs. Sullivan, breaking the eggs and putting down the eggshells to boil. At last he said, with the voice of a very old man, "What are you doing, mammy?" Mrs. Sullivan's heart, as she said herself, was up in her mouth ready to choke her at hearing the child speak, but she contrived to put the poker in the fire and to answer, without making any wonder at the words, "I am brewing, Vic, my son." "And what are you brewing, mammy?" said the little imp, whose supernatural gift of speech was now proved beyond question that he was a fairy substitute. "I wish the poker was red," thought Mrs. Sullivan, but it was a large one, and it took a long time heating, so she determined to keep him in talk until the poker was in proper state to thrust down his throat, and therefore repeated the question. "Is it what I'm brewing, Vic?" said she. "You want to know?" "Yes, mammy, what are you brewing?" returned the fairy. "Eggshells, Vic," said Mrs. Sullivan. "Oh!" shrieked the imp, startling up the cradle and clapping his hands together. "I am 1,500 years in this world, and I have never seen a brewery of eggshells before." The poker by this time was quite red, and Miss Sullivan, seizing it, ran furiously towards the cradle. But somehow or other her foot slipped, and she fell flat on the floor, and the poker flew out of her hand to the other end of the house. However, she got up without much loss of time and went to the cradle, intending to pitch the wicked thing that was in it into the pot of boiling water. When there she saw her own child in a sweet sleep. One of his soft, round arms rested upon the pillow. His features were as placid as if their repose had never been disturbed, save the rosy mouth, which moved with a gentle, regular breathing. That was A Brewery of Eggshells, the entire story. And so another way, as you can see in that story, she boiled eggshells. The fairy was like, "Hey, I've never seen that happen, and I'm over 1,500 years old." And, the mother immediately was like, "You're not my child, then." So another way of ridding the world of these changelings were to bring priests to houses where there were changelings and have them pray the fairy away. And very often, the changeling would grow up before they were even called a changeling. Such is the case with Bridget Clary, a woman killed by her own husband. She was a headstrong woman, which Michael Clary thought was unnatural, so she had to be a changeling, right? She had to be a fairy. He burned her on March 15th, 1895, and when he went into court, he said he claimed he had not harmed his wife at all. He just harmed the changeling. And Bridget Clary was 26 years old. Michael and Bridget were considered to be a very happy couple as well. But no more on that. I'll expand the story in a future episode, probably next week. There are many different articles on Bridget Clary. Look her up. And so I probably missed quite a bit of information on changelings. You probably can't put all the changeling stories into one episode, but I believe I got quite a bit of it. If you have questions, please do comment down below, and if you like this episode, please like the video, subscribe, and hit the bell to be notified every time I post. I like to host my videos live on this channel, so please view announcements in the discussion tab of my channel. This has been the 6th episode of Breaking Fairy. Breaking Fairy. I am Fox, your host, and I shall see you next week with a new video. Bye, everyone.